I now have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker, Nermeen Varawalla. Nermeen is going to give a keynote called Does R&D Offer Opportunities to Address Inequality in Healthcare Access? And I'll give you a very brief outline of why she's probably the most qualified person here to give exactly that talk. She's had an incredibly interesting and diverse career in pretty much every single aspect of healthcare that you can imagine. She started out at the University of Mumbai and got a Bachelor of Surgery and a Bachelor of Medicine, and specialized there later. She then came to Oxford as a Rhodes Visiting Fellow and did a DPhil in clinical medicine and conducted her graduate research at the Varawalla Institute for Molecular Medicine just up the hill in Haddington, where a bunch of us are doing research right now. She then went and joined the NHS and practiced medicine before she went to INSEAD and got an MBA, and then had a number of different roles in all aspects of healthcare, including management consulting. She founded companies and sold companies, and she worked in clinical trials, big and small, all over the world. And fast forward to today, she's now the Senior Vice President and Head of Clinical Development at BTG International, which is a global medical technology business focused on interventional therapies, and she heads up a large portfolio of several different products for them. So please join me in welcoming Nermeen Varawalla.
Good morning, everyone. Two very warm thank yous. One to all of you for joining me here on this glorious November morning. So it's wonderful that you've chosen to be indoors as opposed to in the park. So thank you for that. And a very warm thank you also to Lucas and his organizing committee, primarily to Lucas for inviting me, for that lovely introduction, and to the organizing committee. I think you'll all agree that yesterday was a really inspiring, enjoyable, thought-provoking day, and I very much look forward to today. And I'll just articulate what I think so many of us are thinking. This place is so different from the time we were here, and it's terrific to be able to participate. So I thank you very much for that opportunity. Now, I can't thank or blame Lucas for this very weighty subject that I've taken on myself to reflect on this Sunday morning. Does R&D offer opportunities to address inequality in healthcare access? Whoa, I mean, that's quite a mouthful and quite a large topic. And although Lucas has been kind enough to say I'm qualified to address it, I'm not sure. But what I will do, and this is not meant to be a prescriptive lecture. You'll be relieved to know there are no slides. This is a reflection, and I invite you to reflect with me. And I'm going to try very hard to make sure that there is some time for a two-way discussion at the end of my reflections. So what I'd like to do is draw on my varied career, and the best way of describing my varied career is, in a previous time, a deliverable was a baby. Now it is clinical evidence for FDA registration of a novel therapeutic. So I've kind of done the range. And I'd like to reflect on some of those experiences, the fact that I've had the opportunity to work in many parts of the world to try and address this question. And the way I'll do it is make some overall remarks, share with you 3 case studies, then try and bring it together, and then look forward to your comments. And fingers crossed that'll work. So the way I'd like to start is that let me preface this by saying, and to bring the topic, give it a little more definition, that my role and activity in R&D has been for clinical development of pharmaceuticals and devices, essentially working for pharmaceutical companies. So it's the view of industry, it's the view of business, and it's all around clinical. And to reflect on this, any conversation for global health has to begin with the United States. And why is that? You all know this, we've heard this many times yesterday already. It's the biggest market in value terms. The United States, the Americans want more and more clever, expensive medicines and are prepared to pay for it. Therefore, every major business in the world wants to sell their products to the United States. The United States invests more on pharmaceutical R&D than any other nation, and this is both academia, government, and of course industry. The venture capital industry in the United States is at a different degree and magnitude than anywhere else in the world. The FDA is the authority that we look for in terms of compliance and regulation. If we think of big data, digital health, new big players, disruption, arguably you might say that will all happen from the west coast of the United States. In one area, the US has, of course, got it completely wrong, which is all about the inefficiency, the huge cost of administration with respect to healthcare access. But for those of us who work outside and want to sell into the United States, that is something we spend a lot of time trying to navigate, and we very much hope that they find a solution. But that is not something I'm qualified to talk about. Then the other country I'd like to sketch out for you is India. That's a place where I studied medicine, and that's the place where I've had a number of business ventures. And what's interesting about India in this context is that India is the home for 20% of the world's diseases. India hosts 15% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's diseases. So India carries a very huge disease burden, and these diseases are across the range. So it's tropical diseases, infectious diseases, as well as diseases of what one could term the developed world. So malignancy, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. With respect to pharmaceuticals, India has one of the largest market in volume terms, but fourth largest in value terms. So again, if you were to compare with the United States, what does that mean? That there's a potential to sell a lot of product. However, there is very little opportunity to get value for that, i.e. command a high price for that. The other interesting thing to note about India in this context is India has one of the world's most successful generic pharmaceutical industries. And partly because of regulations around the time of India's independence, the regulatory environment allowed for a patent law which was around, which gave an opportunity for chemists who understood how to change the process to circumvent IP regulation. And as a result, the Indian generic industry has flourished and is one of the largest suppliers of generics across the world. The exports of Indian generics is growing at 20% per year, so it's a big, vibrant, growing industry. And you might argue that one of the reasons why we've been able to achieve some of the goals with respect to HIV in Africa is because of Indian pharmaceutical companies like Cipla. And again, it's a very contentious statement, so I don't want to really go into that, but just bring that to our framework as we reflect today. However, having said all of that, in spite of that huge capability, the Indian pharmaceutical industry has not done very well in their efforts to truly innovate. So the expert copiers have not been able to step up to being innovative in spite of a number of efforts, and also rather disappointingly in the whole area of biopharmaceuticals, and in particular the whole area of biosimilars, India has not been able to progress and gain market share there, so they continue to have expertise in terms of chemistry. The final comment I'll make is that the Indian regulator continues to be backward. Well, no, let me rephrase that. Continues to not be progressive, and as a result takes certain views and regulations which have not allowed the industry to truly flourish. And the best example I can give you is the draconian price control with respect to pharmaceuticals in India. And you can, of course, take the view that India needs to have, there's lots of, the whole issue of access and poverty, so it's important to have drug prices low. But actually what's happened is with the very strict price control, there is now a shortage of pharmaceuticals in India, irrespective of your ability to pay, as Indian generic pharma is now focused on manufacturing and exporting their drugs elsewhere. And again, here there is a lesson that yes, price control is important, but thus far and perhaps no further. And then the final geography I'd like to briefly touch on is the UK. And the NHS, where, as you've heard, I've had the privilege of being an employee for 4 years, continues to be, in spite of all its shortcomings, continues to be a system that is admired by many nations in terms of its ability to provide socialized medicine in a manner where it's still free of cost at the point of access. Of course, there are a number of issues with respect to the NHS delivering this for all inhabitants in the UK. And if the two areas I'll point out where there has been marked progress in the past decade, one has been in the whole area of evaluation of healthcare technologies. NICE is a body that evaluates healthcare technologies, makes some comments about pricing and reimbursement, has made progress compared to other agencies, and is well regarded across the world for that. Again, there are shortcomings, but there is progress there. And the other area, which is very, very, very close to my heart, is that in the past decade, the UK has become a far more attractive place to perform clinical trials. And that's due to the fact that we now have an organization in the NHS that's seeking to attract the clinical trials. And our NHS consultants, academics have always been interested in clinical research. And now with some structures in place, the process is becoming easier for them. And for reasons that we all know, given our proximity to the UK, there are lots of advantages given strong academia, some investments now in NHS digital. That opportunity has improved greatly in the past decade. So having made these overarching comments, I'd now like to move on and share with you three case studies. Again, trying to share with you some experiences that I have, which support the thesis that there is an opportunity, if we rethink the way we look at clinical data, to maybe find a way to address the healthcare access question. So the first example I'll give you, and Lucas was kind enough to allude to that, and it's only appropriate I do that here in Oxford, is my DPhil thesis. So essentially, what my DPhil thesis was, and I'm very, very proud of that piece of work, is I had the opportunity to perform essentially DNA analysis and using PCR when it was a new toy and sequencing when it was a laborious process, and no prizes for guessing how old I am, but that was sort of way back in 1989. So it was it was very exciting. And I had but because of all my Indian connections and the fact that I was a Rhodes visiting fellow from India and had spent many years within the Indian medical system, was able to access at that point 650 samples of Indians from different parts of India with beta thalassemia, which is many of you may know, is the commonest single gene disorder. And I was able to do this with the supervision of David Weatherall, then and still one of the leaders in our understanding of thalassemia. And so what I was able to do was bring that large pool of samples, use this now what seems like primitive technology, and actually characterize this large sample set. And based on that effort and work, it was possible to put together an algorithm on how to perform DNA diagnosis in early pregnancy and therefore offer a viable prenatal diagnosis program, early pregnancy, for Asian Indians, because it was based on their mutations. And I'm very pleased to say that that algorithm has been adopted and continues to be used when this particular testing is done. And what is interesting about this little piece of research is that you have a setting where there's this large sample set which is analyzed swiftly and briskly, and then there is an algorithm that is applied with benefit to that population, and of course also other benefits in those testings and those methods could be applied elsewhere. Now, this thesis was submitted in 1992, and at that stage, as we were reminded yesterday, the internet was really in its infancy. Now, if you think about the whole genomic space compared to the internet, the progress that we've made in the field of human genetics is nowhere in that league. And there are a number of reasons for that. Most importantly, it's a different degree of complexity. But just to kind of complete the circle, I will say that I saw a news announcement last week which announces that the China Health and Education National Body and Big Data Center have undertaken a project where they seek to sequence the genomes of 50,000 samples with a view to understand genetic disease, drug targets, etc. So it's perhaps that piece is coming, and it's taken its while for the technologies to come together, both the sequencing tools as well as the big data analysis tools. And maybe the time is now right for a situation whereby there is this large data set, and now there's the technology to look at that, and therefore the populations that have those large data sets could bring something meaningful and valuable to the R&D table. Moving on to my next example, as you've heard, I've been involved in the clinical trial space. So I made the transition from clinical medicine to being a businesswoman, and partly because I felt that in terms of health, making a more significant impact on the healthcare arena, there's a bigger opportunity through business than being point of care as a clinician. And the area that I got involved in and spent a lot of time working on was the idea that to take clinical trials to India and other emerging countries. And the very simple rationale was that one of the reasons why drugs are so expensive is because R&D is very prolonged. One of the reasons that R&D is prolonged is that the phase 3 clinical trial, where our regulators require us to enroll many hundreds, sometimes many thousands of patients in a randomized controlled trial construct. It's very difficult to find those patients. It's very difficult to recruit those trials. Those trials linger on for a very long time. Cost, inefficiency, lack of access for these treatments, etc. So the one idea, and this is now 15 years ago, was that why don't we take these trials away from the standard markets and take them to where disease is? So it's a well-known fact that, and that sadly hasn't changed, that India has 15% of the, 15% of the population, 20% of the world's disease burden, but attracts only 1.5% of global clinical trials. So the trials aren't being conducted where the patients are. So the idea, and there of course are a number of reasons for that, and the idea was to set up a CRO that would specialize in doing clinical trials in emerging countries, in particular India. And I had a moderate degree of success with that, in that when my first startup managed to do that, there was a lot of interest. I managed to sell that first startup, and then I had the idea a few years later that now it was time to really scale this up. Because although there was a lot of interest, as I've just described, from the utilization of India grew from 0.5% to 1.5%, but nowhere near the 20% that it seemed that the space for growth. But sadly, that did not happen, and I believe will not happen. So in the involvement of a country like India for clinical trials is stagnated at about 1.5%, and trials continue to be done predominantly in the United States and in Europe. Though, as far as Europe is concerned, the spread of clinical trials has gone more eastward to Eastern and Central Europe, but we still haven't really got big about engaging the emerging world with respect to clinical trials. And what were the lessons that I learned from that? And the big lessons were all about the complexity of conducting clinical trials, and that is because it interacts with a number of facets, including, of course, the Indian regulator, the Indian government, political forces, and in the case of India, the media. So we as a pharmaceutical industry, and those of us involved across the board, have done a very poor job of building any trust with our users and customers. So arguably, the pharmaceutical industry has been responsible for the development of products that have transformed the way certain diseases are treated and the impact of certain diseases. Yet we've done a very poor job at building any trust with those very patients whose lives we've transformed. And in the area of clinical trials, instead of clinical trials being positioned as an opportunity to access better health care, to have the spotlight of a clinical trial shone on you as you go through your treatment, it has been labeled as exploitation of patients. Clinical trial participants have been termed to be guinea pigs, and the Indian press has misused its freedom, and that the entire scenario became untenable, and the Indian regulator wasn't prepared to be strong enough. And of course, with respect to any endeavor, but particularly with respect to R&D, the world moves on. Other things have happened, as I mentioned, with respect to the UK becoming more attractive for clinical trials. So that opportunity, I'm sorry to say, has kind of gone away. I will make some final comments about China, and maybe there is hope there. But as far as India is concerned, for the time being, what could have been a very compelling opportunity, whereby India could have come to the scene because of its large patient population, contributed to more effective clinical research, and therefore had a stake in improving the business model for drug development, and hence access to some of those drugs, and that could have led to other developments that sadly was not fulfilled. The final example or case study that I'd like to share with you is with my present work. So within BTG, where I head clinical development, our aspiration is to be a leader in what we call interventional medicine. And you might argue that every medicine is interventional, but what we really mean is we have devices, very sophisticated devices, that we use the advances in imaging to place accurately in a local, regional manner and effect care. And one of those devices are microbeads, which are loaded with radioactivity, which are injected directly into the liver and have an application for liver cancer, both primary as well as secondary. Now, and it's been my responsibility, what I've inherited, is to complete two very large phase 3 studies, one in primary liver cancer, one in secondary liver cancer from colorectal cancer, and so that these products can achieve FDA registration, get incorporated in guidelines, and be used. And I won't give you the details, but there's some very compelling reasons why these therapies need to be made more available. However, recruiting patients for these studies has been very challenging. And what it's worth pointing out is that half the world's disease burden with liver cancer happens to be in China. So there's an important, both in terms of healthcare delivery, in terms of clinical research, in terms of commercial value to our business, to engage with China. And China would be a very exciting geography, A, to do the clinical trials, and B, then to actually commercialize and take our product to those markets. And we, I've been in this organization 2 years, but I know that my company, BTG, we're a British company with lots of assets and interest in the United States, have been unable to actually develop and exploit, deliver, engage with China the way we should, particularly given the relevance of our product in that population. And if I were to reflect the reasons for that, it is the difficulty with negotiating the regulatory hurdle, i.e. Chinese, the Chinese SFDA, two, the concerns about intellectual property, and the third is that as a business, we've not been able to get our mindset around the value-volume equation. We are still, our whole business model is based still on a high price for this, what is true, is a highly sophisticated therapy which certain markets of the world can absorb, instead of finding a way of turning that model around and reducing the price and going for volume in parts of the world where the disease, where our product, the uptake would be magnitudes of what it is today. So having shared those three examples with you, I'm going to try and now summarize a bit for you with giving you three things to reflect on. One is that the business has a very important role to play in addressing the health equity question. And I've been very invigorated and excited to have side conversations with a number of you to know that Rhodes House is alive with lots of exactly such business ideas. And from the comment, however, the caution I'd make, or the comment I'd make, is that healthcare businesses are complex, and it's not just because of the biology, but because of all the other actors and players. And hence, understanding that as one navigates a business through those, through that complexity and through those multiple stakeholders is important. There are no easy answers, and I think previous business failures will help find the next path. And of course, it's worth very much remembering that the business models need to be global by definition. There are changes in technology, particularly with big data, where this whole idea of access to big data sets in return for IP, in return for value, that's a growing area. What those business models would look like, it's for you to discover. And the final comment I'd make is that there is a place for disruption, there's a place for a new business model, particularly with respect to volume and value, and it's the existing players do not have the mindset or the capability to embark on that road, and that is the opportunity for all of you here. So thank you for your very patient listening, and I'd be delighted to take any comments or listen to your questions.
Klaus Rütsch, I spent about 20 years in Hoffmann-La Roche, so I like the comment that you say, this is the business view. I think that we wouldn't cover the whole topic of R&D if we didn't mention the fact there's reimbursement. And it seems to me that while we talk a lot about R&D and the failures of R&D, we don't really recognize that once you have developed a drug, you may not get any money for it. And if you're number 2 or 3 in the market, you may get money which is not sufficient to cover your costs. And I think that I would be very interested if you could address that point of basically having 2 hurdles for the question that we're tackling here and we tackled yesterday.
Thank you. So I did make a passing reference to NICE, as well as so as far as drug development, absolutely. It is now the 4th hurdle, and part of clinical trial design and developing clinical evidence is not just to satisfy the regulator, but also with respect to reimbursement. And our reimbursement authorities are interested in seeing value, but the truth remains that what they really are as the representatives of us taxpayers, their real role is to squash expensive treatments that they where we struggle to show value. And given some of the innovations, innovative innovations we are pursuing, the challenge is a very serious one. So I accept that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Atherton. So my question touches on the matter of complexity with conducting business in healthcare that you touched on when you were about to finish your presentation, with special emphasis on startups. So what are the present and potential future funding models for startups that work on point-of-care diagnostic devices for low volume conditions in low-income countries? So examples being Lassa fever, where we see about 300,000 infections a year, or Ebola, where to the best of my knowledge there is no current outbreak.
So I'm going to cop out. I can't answer that question for you. But the comment, the advice I'd give you is that, so having raised money myself for businesses, at some level you've got to think about, divorce the sector and the actual focus of your business from the funding and think more about it in terms of stage. So what you're describing is an early stage life science venture, and go to funders for that, and the vast majority of them would be family offices, friends and family, when you're a slightly larger state, seed funds, venture capitalists, and those who work, and the vast majority of them are in the Western world, and you would have to persuade them to engage with your business model. And one of the tricks is that you make sure that the business model finds a way that it not only addresses what you're trying to do, but also there is an upside in terms of technology that could then be applied with profit somewhere else.
Hi, Victor Valcor. I'm a geriatrician at UCSF in California and the director of the Atlantic Fellows for Equity and Brain Health Program. My question is colored by the work that I've done in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa. And building on what you began to answer, which is a real dichotomy, and I think an ethical dilemma around where studies are done and where drugs are available. Particularly colored by when I served on a scientific committee for a meeting in Kuala Lumpur. At the time, the hepatitis C treatment was now becoming available, but it wasn't. It was available in the United States, and it looked like it was never going to be available in Southeast Asia. So my question goes back to the discussion you had around being able to have capacity to do studies in India and in China, where these diseases live. But access to those medicines will not occur. How do you reconcile the challenge between access to treatment and, if you will, a very nasty word, exploiting a population that has a high burden of disease in order to get it to the market?
It's a great question, and it's one that I did spend a lot of time on when I was very actively in the field. And some of the proposals, so and mine, just to give you a picture, those days, I mean, I was the CRO working with sponsors, and hepatitis C was one of those areas. And the solution that we put forth to the sponsor is that then you make sure, and particularly when you're thinking of chronic disease, so the trial gets over, then what are you going to do to patients who've had the drug, it works for them, and you'd like to be able to continue the drug, and the drug's not available in market. So one of the ideas we put forth is that then you immediately begin a post-study registry, and you have a pool of drug which you then distribute to those patients, and then from the sponsor's perspective continue to collect outcome data. Those were the sorts of solutions we offered. I'm sorry to say none of them really took off. And one of the reasons why the use of emerging countries for some of these disorders has been exactly that there's a distrust in sponsors with respect to the ethics of the market access question, and also an actual distrust of the mechanism to actually distribute. There's always a concern that they're expensive product would be in some way compromised. And my solution would be, which is a difficult one, I've never been able to persuade any sponsor to do it, is that just take the view that in those countries, you get into an agreement where you're prepared to give the drug at a very reduced price for a certain period of time, and then work with governments with respect to access.
Hi, it's loud. Mary De Silva from the Wellcome Trust. I wanted to respond to the comment about diagnostics, because I think this is an example of where foundations can work better with industry. So there's obviously there's no market for diagnostics in low incidence diseases. So Wellcome has an initiative where we're developing vaccines for emerging infections and also diagnostics for those infections. So come and talk to me about whether you'd be eligible to apply for that. And then my question is, how can foundations work better with industry so that these gaps in the market can be plugged?
The industry has a fairly good record of working closely with academia. So we, as an organization, we do that relatively well. Now we've started working with patient support groups, but working with foundations, the successful examples of that, in my experience, are limited. And with respect to the pharmaceutical industry, one approach would be that if foundations were prepared to get into volume purchasing of certain pharmaceuticals and then take a responsibility for distribution. That might be an area.
So I've been working with an organization in Oxford that it's a meta company, so it starts other companies with Oxford research. And one of the companies, or even thinking back, we'd like to translate a lot of the operations to India and China and build on commercial opportunities there. Had a case study with one of these companies for fundraising and a commercial development with the company, with a Chinese partner. And a couple things that stood out to me. One, spending a year on it, it was amazing to see that I don't think there was a single example of a pharma partnership between a Chinese company and a foreign one that was actually successful over a 3-5 year period, ever. Or there are just very few, is the way I'd put it. And the other thing that occurred to me was that even from an organizational design perspective, if you're sitting in the UK and most of your business is focused in the US, having the attention bandwidth to go and develop an operation very far away was very challenging. And I guess I'd ask the question of, even from an organizational design perspective, how much of a challenge is it to go and develop something in a market that looks very different from the markets that the drug development is coming from? And then how do you go about doing that? And what are case studies that you look to that are successful for those models?
So let me very briefly address that by reminding you that, of course, pharmaceutical companies, the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, are global by definition, and have a long-standing record of selling pharmaceuticals to all over the world. So the commercial operation, to large extent distribution, exists. What is weak, as you rightly point out, is the clinical development piece. And the one model of trying to address that is through what's known as the contract research industry. And that again is a multi-billion-dollar industry, again global. And the biggest players in this industry have offices around the world with the capacity to set up clinical trials in all these various offices. So I fully accept that at a startup stage, it's mind-boggling, but at the global big business stage, it exists. And also, having said that, within the healthcare setting, startups are increasingly global, and to put a small team together, that's what many startups do.
I had a question about the ethics, and I'd like to go back to Dr. Valcour's raising of the ethics question, especially in a conference on health equity and how we can improve health equity. It seems to me that one of the angles being taken is that there are these very effective and new treatments that are now available, and to improve equity, then they should be available to everybody. However, if we take the liver cancer example, if you were the Minister of Health in China and you had a limited pot of resources and your goal was to improve the health of the entire population and reduce gaps, particularly for those who are most poor and most vulnerable, would you be wisely spending your dollars by purchasing these very expensive products, or would you choose to spend more of that money on buying, for instance, vaccines and improving the systems of vaccine distribution to prevent these diseases? And even with the hepatitis C example, screening blood products and making sure you have a good system for that. Promoting mental health, reducing addictions and IV drug use. So where would you be spending your limited dollars to really improve health equity, and how much of it really should be spent on, I think that there's a continuum, but if you were the minister, how much would you protect your health system from some of these very high cost end of life treatments versus, going with prevention and going to vaccination and things like that?
So, if from a public health perspective, absolutely, the points you make are absolutely spot on. But of course, we must remember that populations like India, China, and many other countries in the world, there's a huge growing middle class. So the middle class population of China with hepatocellular carcinoma, there are many individuals there who will pay $5,000 a year easily for this therapy. It's that market that's very large and substantial. And we've now got to move the whole healthcare equity question at different levels. So yes, of course, there are these public health questions as well, but there is a big growing population which is prepared to self-pay, which would like access to these drugs, and all of this has to move in parallel.
So my name is Vishwajit Mgaonkar. I was actually born in Mumbai, and I did my MBBS in India. And I'd like to sort of say that I agree with all the reasons that you gave out for not having more breakthroughs in Indian research. But would you like to comment about the possibility that our educational system is so sclerotic that it doesn't really encourage research? And is this something that's happening in other developing countries also? And in the longer term, is that something we should be addressing better?
So before I comment on our sclerotic education system, let me check whether we went to the same medical school. I went to GS Medical College. But so, yes, so there are, but both in India and China, one of the big kind of social areas for investment has to be education. And what the Indian system struggles with, but it hasn't done too badly if we're both in this room, but what it struggles with is teaching debate, questioning, problem solving, analysis, all of that, which is the building blocks of research. So which is perhaps one of the reasons why the generic industry is relying on local talent, and to some extent the IT industry has been fantastic at process refinement and scaling up process, but struggle with true creativity and innovation. However, it's also fair to say that the Indian diaspora, and it's certainly true for a number of other countries, have had the privilege of an Indian basic education and then an education of the finest institutes in the world. And there was a time when I still should be, much more optimistic about ties being formed by diaspora in academia, the best institutions in the world, back with Indian institutions. And that is happening, but not to the extent that perhaps it should have, and that again, I think, is partly linked to the bureaucracy of the Indian education system.
Do the major pharmaceutical companies pay taxes on profits, but much more importantly on sales, and whether they pay them?
So, well, I mean, most pharmaceutical companies in the world have to follow corporate taxation. They may have very clever corporate tax lawyers, but they certainly have to file tax accounts. And yes, they have.
Where do they pay taxes, especially on sales?
So the pharmaceutical companies pay taxes on profits.
Yeah.
And so the way, for example, GlaxoSmithKline, they have GlaxoSmithKline India, which has its own list of accounts, and pays taxes both in country as well as they pay taxes elsewhere. I look at my friend in the audience from Roche, and he seems to agree, so I'll agree.
I'm Chen Hui, one of the Atlantic Fellow from China. I like to comment on the things you mentioned about China, because personally I know that there's a certain economical consideration behind like why China has this barrier problem. One is in terms of protect the local business, local pharmaceutical companies. Yes. So even after joining the WHO, Chinese government decided not to open up the drug market because they want to protect the local industry. But 20 years afterwards, actually nothing happened. So they decided to open up recently. So my question is, what do you see is the economical or thinking behind like why Indians choose that kind of approach, put up those regulations, or if there's like ideological thinking behind this, like even though I can draw more clinical trials to my country, but actually pharmaceutical companies are taking advantage of our large population rather than building up our own R&D capacity. So I'm trying to see what is the like economical or ideological thinking behind all these. Well, comparing to like UK, you mentioned, actually take a quite open gesture about this.
So it's a question I've grappled a lot with. So how do you persuade? So the way I would try and answer the question is say, how could I persuade the Indian government, and you could replace India with Chinese government, to say, don't put down so many barriers to global clinical trials. Appreciate that it's good for our population. Open the doors. Be willing to collaborate. And I did try, and sadly, my voice was not powerful, and the reason it wasn't powerful is because I was slapped down for saying, we can't, you say you're an Indian doctor, but hey, you are the owner and founder of a CRO with lots of commercial gain of this work, so we ain't listening to you. Fair enough. Okay, so I had to step back. But the conversation was really all about the governments of countries like India and China are very distrustful of Western pharmaceutical companies. And they take exactly that view, that you want to come here and sell your products to our people, you want to make big profits, you're after our markets, you don't really care. And there have been ways, and Global Pharma have tried in it, and to be fair, to some extent to get access to that population, have put in various initiatives to do drug discovery in India. So for example, Novartis has, the number of examples have actually built drug discovery units, attempted to do clinical trials, but that has, on either side, it's never been strong enough. And essentially our governments have been, both India and China, far too distrustful. And as far as India is concerned, the other the other elephant in the room was India's IP laws. So although India agreed to sign up to the TRIPS agreement, some of the rulings by Indian courts with respect to license infringement, pricing of global pharmaceutical products was contentious. So it's been that there is a culture of mistrust, and I'm sorry to say I don't think it's soon to be resolved.
Hi, my name's Richard, and I have a question about drug pricing. So I'm a scholar studying public health and an MBA. And I can appreciate that drugs are very expensive to develop. I worked with a vaccine manufacturer in South Africa for some time. But at the same time, I do feel that drug pricing is a huge barrier to equitable health access. I mean, we talked about the hepatitis C drug, and Dr. Valcour said it was accessible in the United States, but sofosbuvir, this drug made by Gilead, cost $87,000 for a treatment, and it was not available unless you had premier insurance or could afford it out of pocket. And hepatitis C is a drug that primarily affects injection drug users, poor populations, vulnerable populations, prison populations. And they did not have access to the drug. It was not covered. There's a law in the United States that says prisoners have to receive care, and they were not given access to this drug because it was so expensive. And I took a class on drug development, and we met someone who was on the team of creating this drug. And the majority of the money going into this drug was not R&D, but it was marketing. And I just want to ask, and something you said earlier was there is a market in China, for instance, that is willing to pay $5,000 for this liver drug, which is great. But should this disease, should hepatitis C be a disease that is treatable only for the rich? Is it not a problem that, if you're poor and don't have, financial access to the drug, then, you're kind of just left there to not have it? Is that okay with you? And if it's not, what do you see as the role of regulatory authorities or self-policing within pharmaceutical industries to cap the prices of drugs and make them more affordable?
So it's certainly not okay with me. That's easy. So the question is, but why do we still live with it? And so one of the reasons is that we and many other of our competitors, when we, as a business, when we build our business cases, when we decide how to juggle various priorities, the price point in the United States and sales in the United States is a very important metric. So that, whether we like it or not, is very much governing a lot of, at the big company level, pharmaceutical R&D. So you could then take the view that, okay, there has to be another way. And maybe that other way is to have certain drugs which from the outset have a business model where you're not looking at what the price in the United States, but looking very much at a volume, at a massive procurement. The procurement could be done, let's say, by an NGO, by a consortia of governments, and that is the business model from the outset, and indeed then that is the clinical development model from the outset. And there are a few examples of this, and I like to believe that will grow, and the idea that the present model, i.e. big pharma, the pharmaceutical model, the way it's structured today, will address that problem, probably not. And there is another way forward.
That's actually a wonderful answer to what I was going to say, but I still want to take the opportunity to thank you for coming to speak to this audience. As a clinician, we don't have this opportunity in the United States. The pharmaceutical companies and the clinicians have a big brick wall. We don't allow people to speak at our conferences. We don't hear the voices. We're not having these discoveries. But here at Rhodes House, the arguments that I've heard over the past few days are really around innovation, thinking outside the box. And the comment you just made to me is the strength of this conversation, that there may be a model that it allows the business model to work and to make money, but is more at a grassroots, serving large volumes at small cost than small volumes at large cost. And there are some diseases that would lend themselves very well to this model. Perhaps liver cancer is one, particularly because it's so tightly linked to hepatitis C and other infectious diseases. So I wanted to kind of close out my comment to, one, thank you for taking on this audience because it could be challenging, it has been, but also to, in the spirit of what I've heard in the past few days, think creatively, innovatively around how this could be solved for equity.
Thank you. I'm told that's the last question. Please, go ahead.
Hello, I have a question about the entire pricing model that you're talking about. And if I remember right, in India this happened. I think this was Novartis and the drug was Glivec. So Glivec was, I believe, priced at rupees 97,000. And the Supreme Court struck down that ruling and made it at rupees 9,000. Now something like rupees 97,000 or close to 120 pounds is pretty much unaffordable anywhere in the world to a large number of people. Say in the UK or the US it would be unaffordable except for state subsidized insurance. So to what extent do you think that pharmaceutical companies are able to have a market because of such insurance schemes in several countries, and that's what actually encourages them to have a certain price point? And in the presence of a growing population and a growing disease burden in India and China, without such insurance models and the consequent pressure by the judicial systems to reduce these prices, would that lead to an increasing supply chain efficiency to extract more profits? Would that be a good thing in the long run?
So are you saying the insurance companies would?
The presence of affordable insurance to finance the purchasability or the willingness to pay for certain drugs, how far does it stifle the willingness of the pharma players to cut down on the supply chain inefficiencies when they're actually considering the pricing of the products? A. In the presence of judicial systems that actively set caps on the prices that are chargeable in, say, large disease burden or large population countries like India and China, how far do pharmaceutical companies actually make their supply chains and marketing more efficient, and is that a good thing in the long run?
And no, many thanks for raising the question of insurance. One of the things I didn't mention is that the coverage, the insurance coverage in India, of the population of India, is still only in the mid-teens. So it's a very low coverage. And of course, not surprisingly, given the disease burden, disease is still one of the major causes of pushing people below the poverty line. And without a robust insurance system of some form, absolutely, getting expensive drugs, not to mention other health services, is a real issue. And I believe there are efforts to improve insurance coverage in India, but there's a very, very long way to go. And this is a bit of a segue, but the only other comment I'd make is that with so many diseases, whether we like it or not, the solution is with drugs and devices. And particularly with drugs, the investment to make these drugs is being done predominantly with the European, US companies, and for historical reasons, this group is kind of decades ahead. Therefore, the idea that, we in India and China will make our own drugs, that is perhaps not the most clever way of thinking about this, but it's really all about collaboration. And what in-country Indian businesses or local businesses can solve is supply chain, payment, access, but the actual R&D that, if you use the Indian generic industry as an example, that sector is decades behind progress that's been made elsewhere.
Thank you.
I think with that I will stop. And thank you very much for all your engaging questions. The discussion has given me much more food for thought, and I will be reflecting on a number of the things we talked about. Thank you for being such a great audience.